Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, as always, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by my very good friends and your very good friends at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA works very hard to support animal studies scholars in Australia and around the world. ASA needs your support in order to function. It's a membership organisation. Membership is just $50. So if you're not already a member of ASA, please think about joining ASA. ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, this episode is also coming to you from Mexico City. I'm still at the Minding Animals conference, and I still am very lucky to be surrounded by international animal studies scholars of all disciplines and from all parts of the world. Now, today we're joined by Professor Jody Emel from the Graduate School of Geography at Clark University in the United States. I was very lucky to meet Jody and in fact spend a few nights in her place when I was had a summer residency at Clark University. So it's a great pleasure to have Jody on the podcast. And today we're going to discuss Jody's journal article, Evaluation of the Land Grab, Absurdism, Decolonialism and Postanthropocentrism, which will soon be published in a special issue of the journal Resources. Welcome to the podcast, Jody.
Thank you, Siobhan.
So, Jody, can you start by telling us what led you to do this piece?
Let's see, what led me to do this piece? Well, I've been working on against CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, for a long time. And I also have been working on water for quite a while, many decades. And I was also working on land grabbing with a student earlier who was studying land grabbing in Laos. But this is a piece that I came to by way of discovering that the feedlots in Southern California are populated with dairy calves because the dairy industry is the biggest by value agricultural industry in California, and something has to be done with all of those unwanted calves because, as you know, you have to keep the cows birthing in order for them to lactate. So all these dairy calves are in these giant feedlots in this 110-degree weather, and I was really upset about that. And then I found out that after some more interviewing that they keep about half the female calves so that they can replenish the herds, the industrial dairy herds. And they have what's called a dry lot dairy industry in California, which means that the dairies look like feedlots also because they don't have pasture. They just stand around in these confined spaces where they're fed. And so anyway, they only take half the girls and they don't take any of the boys. And so they go directly to the actual feedlots. The girls that they keep get shipped up to Utah or Idaho, where they're actually fed a milk substitute, a cow milk substitute, because, it's too expensive to feed them actual cow milk. And then they're shipped back down to the Southern California dry lot dairies. And as if this wasn't crazy enough, I found out that a lot of the alfalfa that is mostly grown for dairy cows is it's one of the most irrigated crops. It takes as much water as you can give it because you can keep cutting it during the year. And it is watered by Colorado River water, which is the most overutilized river in the world, and with some of the oldest rights on the river. So so and after that, I found out that the Saudi Arabians and the UAE have alfalfa farms in California and Arizona because it's against the law, at least in Saudi Arabia, to use water to grow alfalfa. And now they have industrialized dairies. So I thought this was really a very strange geopolitical and environmental and animal welfare situation. And we started calling it the assemblage of the absurd. And then I started looking at absurd theater, that was like, that followed the Dadaists and the Surrealists. And I don't know where that's going exactly, but I do think that this geopolitics of alfalfa is really strange.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think that, in a sense, the United States is being used as kind of the farm for Saudi Arabia, because, we think of America as this great global power that's more prone to exploiting than being exploited. But it sounds like in this case, the exploiting is happening on American soil. It's the exploitation of, the waterways.
Yes, and the groundwater that's being pumped on the Arizona side is non-renewable groundwater. So once it's gone, it's gone. And I went out and looked at the Saudi Arabian, it's not really a farm. I mean, it's just a big alfalfa growing operation near Blythe, California. And you have to look at the land records to see where it really is, because of course they're not advertising it. But I found that lots of people know about these places, and these same rural areas tend to be the areas that vote for, more militarization and tend to be more hawkish. And yet here, maybe they've decided that it doesn't matter whether we export the alfalfa or we export the water, because it's all going to the same places. And there has been a huge jump in alfalfa exporting, partly because for every 2 container ships that come over from Asia, 1 goes back empty from the west coast of the U.S. So it's cheaper. Someone told me that it was cheaper to ship alfalfa from Long Beach, California to Japan than it is to ship it north by truck or train to the dairies in Northern California. I don't know if that's really true, but
interesting. So it's also a story about water prospecting. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about the water side?
Well, so there's this constant dearth of water in California and the Southwest in general. And one of the things that's so interesting about this is that anyone can come in and buy up these old water rights. And we have this antiquated water system which doesn't require anything other than that you abide by the beneficial use of the water. And of course they're private, and it's not, the government has to say whether or not the transfer can go through, but usually they don't have any issues with it. So, yeah, in that regard, it seems to me like we need an overhaul of the water system, because this is efficient money-wise, but as one of the talks today in my panel session remarked upon, the subsidies to these industries are huge. So if you really didn't subsidize all this stuff, these water rights weren't so cheap to buy, you would not be able to do this.
And what kind of picture did you get in terms of the animal welfare impacts of having these dry lots, these dry dairy lots?
Well, first, they're the dairy cows are, I just find the whole industrial dairy industry horrific. And I don't actually find local dairying any better, really, because it's, I interviewed people locally where I lived in Massachusetts, and they still have to take the calves away. They don't even touch the udders because they might damage them. So, and I've, read the stories and talked to the farmers about how the calves and the mothers will bawl until they go hoarse. And they had to even close down one of the Vermont has this kind of idyllic dairy representation going, but they had to close down one of the organic dairies because they were bringing in bob veal, which is what the U.S. calls like 24-hour-old calves, or maybe they'd be 48 hours old, but they can barely stand, and yet the so-called Humane Slaughter Act means that they have to be able to walk through the slaughter line or get to that first point. And so there's nothing really humane about being artificially inseminated and constantly pregnant and then lactating way more than you're supposed to, and then doing it in the 110-degree heat or more. I mean, sometimes in Imperial Valley it gets to be 120, and they might have some spritzing that goes on to cool the cows down, but there's nowhere for them to go. There's some awnings for them to get some shade from, but they're bored to death. Every time I drive out there, there'll be one standing on a little tiny hill of manure just staring at me because all they do is eat.
And it's interesting that you can go and bear witness to their lives. Is it kind of, there's a lot of talk about the hidden nature of industrial farming. Is this kind of out of the way, or if you're driving along, you could see the cows perhaps?
You have to know where you're going. You really have to know. You can actually figure it out by the smell, too. If you're not exactly sure which way to turn, you can smell it. But you do have to know where you're going, and you have to know. The feedlots seem to be right off highways. They don't seem to be trying to hide anything. The slaughterhouses are also harder to find, and I've been yelled at and threatened with the police for not even being on their property, but being next door on somebody else's property taking pictures. And of course, we have the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act in the U.S., where you only have to have the intent to cross state borders to do harm to an animal enterprise.
That's a very high threshold that's been set. So, Jody, you're one of the preeminent geographers who deals with animal issues, and at this conference, one of the sessions is celebrating the 20th anniversary of your landmark book. Can you say a little bit about how you've seen the field change in those 20 years in terms of animals and geography?
Well, I think that it's changed a lot in Canada and Europe and Australia, and I'm not sure that it's changed all that much in the U.S. And I don't know why that reluctance is, unless it's because the U.S. is basically a resource exporting country. And, like I said, dairy is the number one agricultural product in California, which is one of the biggest agricultural economies in the world. So maybe it's the power of the national councils. But I don't think that the National Science Foundation, which is our preeminent funding body, has not really supported animal geography or animal anything that I know of very much.
Oh, well, that's a shame. I was expecting a good news story.
It's probably better than I'm saying. I mean, there's definitely more people interested. I'm kind of, I wish it was a better story. I think if you're living someplace else like you are, it is.
Yeah. Okay, Jody. Well, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Oh, I guess.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I think it was a Peter Singer pamphlet or something.
Yeah. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, it was the piece about are you man enough, big and bad enough, about wolf eradication in the United States.
Oh, wonderful. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I think Donna Haraway's work has had a big impact. So many people, I can't even...
Yeah, people often are reluctant to name just one.
Yes, Harriet Ritvo's work, Matt Cartmill's work, all the ecofeminist work. There's so many.
What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I actually think that they can keep writing and they can do more research and not the same research. I see the same research done over and over again. And I also think that teaching shouldn't be forgotten to be like a very important undertaking, because a lot of students don't know very much about how animals are produced.
So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think that all life should be valued. And then starting from that, we can have a conversation about how that would work, because it's almost an impossibility to think about. But I really think that all life has to be valued.
So, Jody, what are you working on next?
Well, I'm still I'm going to work more on this assemblage of absurdity, and I would like to actually follow the cows up to Utah and see what these gigantic milk, lactation machines look like. And but I also am really interested in the Trump administration's bashing of the national organic standards that had provided some welfare protections for animals. So I want to find out how all these different groups are going to work together to fight those.
Sounds fabulous. So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, there's a website at Clark University. I think that's probably the best way.
Wonderful. Well, Jody, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. Also, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.